The Seth Leibsohn Show, where it's principles, not politics. Now, guest hosting for Seth, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Sitting in for Seth Leibsohn as he takes some time off this week, and it is a pleasure to be back with you today, covering for him this whole week and talking to you about principles, not politics. And again, a lot to talk about. Today we'll probably bring it more into domestic issues and what is the talk of the day. I can't help but start first. I know yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about Iran, Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress, and in the fallout of that, I was looking at your friendly enemy media abroad, especially Farsi news agency in Iran or the Syrian news agency, and guess whose mug was on the front page of their homepage for a few hours last night? Wait for it. Congresswoman Pelosi. Yes, congratulations, Congresswoman Pelosi. Your statement that you were near tears because the U.S. intelligence was insulted by Prime Minister Netanyahu made it to the leading terror regime of the world's homepage news service and propaganda. So that's, when you're representing a constituency in America and your verbiage becomes the tool of a propagandist fascist machinery, maybe you need a gut check to see exactly what it is you're saying and whether it makes any sense. But anyways, this morning it wasn't there anymore. And, I just thought it was quite fascinating to see that. And you also look at the Farsi news agency and you'll find, the climate change report that NBC News had that we talked about yesterday. They were linking climate change to the failures of their ability to control ISIS and other aspects. And the other thing on the front page of Farsi News is the saddening aspect of Iranian forces helping take over Tikrit and push back ISIS. Now, obviously, there is a good thing there that we don't want ISIS to spread, but the saddening part is that American treasure and blood and tears with our men and women who served went to free Iraq and not allow it to become a client state of Iran. And unfortunately, that's what we see happening in the name of defeating ISIS. And on the front page, they are proud that Mosul and especially Tikrit pushed back ISIS with the help of Iran. That's what our enemy's news is saying today. What are we saying? And let's look at, we have a lot to talk about today. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for my good friend Seth Leibsohn as he's away. I'm a physician in private practice here locally, and I run an organization called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy at aifdemocracy.org. And we are Muslims dedicated to combating political Islam, radical Islam, and countering the ideas that the radicals swim in and that produces them, and ultimately reforming Islam to separate mosque and state. And we started after 9/11 and have continued to grow nationally and now globally as we build alliances of Muslims that are countering not just violence, but the root cause that we thought the White House would be addressing and they claim to be addressing, but they never have been, the root cause of political Islam or radical Islam. Today, there are a number of things happening domestically. We've seen a couple things that I want to run through. We're going to talk about the veto override failure by Congress today to try to get the Keystone Pipeline approved. Talk about this major case in the Supreme Court. As a physician in private practice, I have been following very closely, and since its inception, we've been trying to fight Obamacare and what it is doing to savage the independence of the free practice of medicine, and ultimately a major case today in the Supreme Court, is confronting the question of subsidies and how can they be done through the federal exchange versus the state exchanges, and beyond sort of the intricacies of Obamacare. And the issue with this is whether it'll turn Obamacare into a house of cards. Will it all fall apart? Will this be the string that unravels the governmental control of national health care through the program of Obamacare. And we're going to talk to John Malcolm, a legal expert from Heritage Foundation, soon about that. And then the Boston bomber trial started officially. And while it is even the defense admitted that he did it, the question is whether the Boston bomber was driven by his brother or whether he was driven by a intent to kill and an intent to massacre innocents in his holy war, quote unquote, as the prosecution said. And I think that's very germane to this battle that we're fighting. And, I do want to mention as an aside, you look at the CNN report on this, and the defense was concerned about the homogeneity of the jury in Boston and whether it could be fair. They were talking about the homogeneity of the jury. So to them, because it was middle-class Americans and what they described as all white, that would make it unfair that he would be prosecuted and get the death penalty as a result, and it would be, because of racial tensions, unfair. These individuals are from the Caucasus areas, and Islam is not a race, it's an ideology. So the Caucasus, actually Caucasian means white. So how there's racial discrimination in a white jury when you have a white client from the Caucasus is just absurd. Not to mention that there were not racial tensions involved in this conviction, hopefully, and as we hope that he gets sent to his death. It's just amazing sometimes how every news story becomes an attempt to try to get the racial element out of it. And we'll also be talking later with Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery about radical Islam and the threat and what smart police work is. And I have talked before about the Al Sharptonization of Islam in the Muslim community, which is that somehow our community has become, rather than a religion and an ideology which is diverse with debates within its community, it has become a monolithic single issue with no debate about what happens within the community, theology versus theocracy versus liberty, but rather the Al Sharptonization that somehow every issue is related to race and bigotry. So that's some of the issues. And also with there's a lawsuit that CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is trying to defend one of the accomplices that was involved in the terror scheme of the Tsarnaev brothers. And ultimately, he was being questioned by the FBI and was shot. We are going to talk about whether their lawsuit against the FBI and the mechanism in which that happened, what's behind that, and what's evolving as they just filed that suit. And the timing could not be more interesting as the Boston bomber trial also is ongoing. So soon we're going to be joined by John Malcolm, but it is amazing to me now as we look at healthcare in America, the case of King versus Burwell is being heard. And the question is, will the Supreme Court put Obamacare on life support? Is it a house of cards that will fall? I'm looking forward to talking to John Malcolm. It's interesting, if you step back and look at one other story that I wanted to share with you, is we talked about this Keystone Pipeline. And when you look at the Keystone Pipeline, all of the discussion in national media has been that somehow this vote was, and I think very rightly so, the conservatives were unable to get the 67-vote margin they needed to override the president's veto. They only had 62 to 37. But they said, for example, Dan Coates, Senator Coates, said the Senate's failure to override President Obama's veto is a defeat for our economy and American workers. Obama and a majority of Senate Democrats have said no to creating new jobs and increasing our energy security, despite support from the majority of Americans. This important pro-growth project remains in political paralysis. And ultimately, a Fox News report says Democrats and other opponents say that drilling for the oil in Canada's tar sands will emit too much greenhouse gas and contribute to global warming. Amazing. Senator Barbara Boxer, Democrat from California, said that she told the Hill newspaper earlier this week that the effort to override the veto was a ludicrous idea and rejected the idea of attaching Keystone to the highway legislation. And ultimately, more political hand-wringing over this. I wanted to talk about it because the element that isn't discussed about Keystone is this is a national security issue. And one of our good friends to both me and Seth, Seth introduced me to him as the former head of the CIA under Clinton, Jim Woolsey. And Jim has been extremely outspoken about, he has a quote that I've stolen and used many times in my speeches, and in which he said, he tells Americans, if you want to blame anyone for radical Islam and the spread of terrorism, look in the mirror before you fill up your gas tank. Look in the mirror before you fill up your gas tank. What happens? We ultimately pay the Saudis, who are fueling their ideology of Wahhabism, where this little tribe that would have been nothing but a dot in history, a Wahhabism of a tribe in a peninsula of deserts in Saudi Arabia gets spread because of billions of petrodollars, and now, as Jim has said, over $90 to $100 billion have been spent only on propaganda, certain translations of the Quran that teach militancy, not what we believe are reform translations, modern translations of passages, but draconian evil translations that fuel groups like ISIS. That's what's being spent by petrodollars. So, Keystone, a pipeline that would allow us to obtain more energy on our own, to tell the Arab OPEC and OIC countries that they can drink their own oil and we don't need it, would do more to protect this country and than anything I can think of in the long term. So as we look at long-term strategies against radical Islam, why isn't anybody talking about that with Keystone? I don't get it. Ultimately, this is the way. If you look post-World War II, the reason Japan reformed and became a moderate capitalist country was because it had no natural resources. The best thing, as my grandfather used to say, as he rejected working with the monarchs in Saudi Arabia, that could happen to the Arab countries is for their oil to dry up, because then they'd have to use the resources between their ears. When we come back, we'll continue our talk about the Keystone Pipeline. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn. It's great to be sitting in his chair, and an honor, and as he takes some time off this week. I'll get back. We had talked about the Keystone Pipeline and its issue of national security that I think has been ignored in the media, but I will get back to that, as now I am just honored to be joined by legal scholar John Malcolm. He's the director of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies and a senior legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation. So welcome to the show, John.
Thanks for having me on, Zuhdi.
Oh, it's great to be with you. And, I had to have you on today as I looked early this morning anxiously as a physician struggling in small practice here in Arizona, and hoping for the day that, and I saw all these headlines about, will this be the thread that unravels Obamacare, and what's going to happen? And I started to think of House of Cards. Will this be the House of Cards that makes it all fall apart? And, the issue today in front of the Supreme Court is about subsidies. It's about if patients who had subsidies through federal agencies, the federal program that avoided the state ones, do they have an exemption or not? And I'd like you to walk us through what the case is briefly, and then talk about maybe what happened today in court.
Sure. Well, it really comes down to what Congress meant when it used the four words established by the state when they were talking about tax credit subsidies. So the way Obamacare is set up is either the states run an exchange, or if states refuse to run an exchange, then a federal exchange is established. The plaintiffs, who believe that that established by the state means what most people think it means, which means an exchange that is a state-run exchange, argue that the tax credit subsidies are only available to citizens who purchase insurance on a state-run exchange, and that those subsidies are not available to citizens who purchase insurance on the federal exchange. This was offered as an inducement to the states to try to get them to set up their own exchanges. However, the administration made, in my view, a political miscalculation in that it proved to be an insufficient inducement. And over 30 states said, you know what, we will forego the tax credit subsidies, come on in and you, federal government, run the exchange. All of a sudden, the administration had a problem on its hands because people in 30-some-odd states were no longer getting these tax subsidies. So they went to the IRS and they said, well, this really deals with the tax credit. We think this law is vague. Why don't you, IRS, issue a clarifying regulation? The IRS did so and said, oh, actually what the law means is the tax credit subsidies are available to everyone, whether they apply on the federal exchange or on a state-run exchange. The plaintiffs have challenged that IRS interpretation as being clearly against what the law states, and that's what this case was about.
Well, do you think that if they make that before we get to actually what happened today,
sure.
Do you think by making that challenge, though, it almost seems like they're arguing a small point where if they had written the law right, it's almost as if we're arguing that they should have made that, given the federal exchange the right to do that, and because they didn't, we're going to say gotcha, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I don't think it's really a question of gotcha. It's not just whether or not tax credit subsidies go to taxpayers in those states, but there are other mandates that go along with those tax credit subsidies. So in states that reject, if the plaintiffs win this case, then the individual mandate and the employer mandates will largely go by the wayside in those 30-some-odd states that operate on the federal exchange, because those provisions are triggered by the availability of tax credits. Conservatives, of course, believe that it's things like these mandates that drive up the cost of insurance. But in any event, our position is that language was in there for a reason. The reason it was there was to provide this inducement to the states. The federal government wanted the states to run these exchanges, but they could not require them to do so. So as Congress has done on numerous occasions, they had to offer carrots and sticks to try to induce them to do it. The carrot in this case was tax credit subsidies for those citizens, but it proved to be an insufficient carrot.
And you really clarified that a lot, and I think it's so important that it's not just a gotcha. We're looking also at the unraveling of these mandates, and that it's connected to that. Can you now tell us about what happened today as you looked at the transcripts and what
Sure.
materialized?
Well, it was a very interesting argument. You had two legal heavyweights going at it, Mike Carvin on behalf of the plaintiffs and Solicitor General Don Barilli on behalf of the government. Mr. Carvin was up first. He immediately got attacked, actually, by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, well, gosh, it appears to me that there is a real question about whether any of your four clients, in fact, have standing to bring this lawsuit. That is a constitutional requirement that there actually be a case or controversy. Whoever brings a lawsuit has to have standing, and there have been a number of articles in the Washington Post or whatnot questioning whether these four plaintiffs have standing. I believe that Mike Carvin sufficiently batted it away, and indeed when he got up to make his argument, General Barilli appeared to concede that at least one of the four plaintiffs was going to have standing and that the case was alive. Then where the liberal justices went after Mr. Carvin was essentially to say and to talk about, aren't there going to be draconian circumstances that will happen here if all of these millions of people who purchase coverage on the federal exchange lose those tax subsidies? And they really tried to draw attention away from the plain language in the statute to talk about the consequences. It actually bled into an interesting constitutional argument. It was somewhat of a bizarre argument, but it certainly got the attention of Justice Anthony Kennedy, which from a conservative standpoint is somewhat troubling. Essentially what they said was, look, if the tax subsidies go away in these 34 states and the individual mandate goes away and the employer mandate goes away, that will begin a death spiral for Obamacare. And at that point, there will be so much pressure on those 34 states to establish their own state-run exchanges. Isn't this an unconstitutional coercion of the states to force them to adopt a federal scheme? Mike Carvin argued. He got support from Justice Alito, Justice Scalia, saying, look, Congress offers carrots and sticks all the time. In this case, by the way, they're not even offering a subsidy to the state. They are offering something to the citizens of those states. They can take that away if they want to. And that if you were to go down this road of finding this to be an unconstitutional coercion, you would have to rewrite an awful lot of the court's past jurisprudence, and you would have to revisit an awful lot of statutes.
Well,
nonetheless, this certainly got Justice Kennedy's attention, who appeared to say, well, gosh, if we adopt your interpretation, Mr. Carbon, this might open up a real constitutional problem. We ought to take that into account.
Well, the latter thing makes sense to me, is that that's a reasonable argument to make. What's bizarre, though, and I'd like to talk about this when we come back, John,
Sure.
is that argument about draconian circumstances that this causes. Is the whole question is this decision going to be a political one about the result, or is it one on the law? What does the law say? And when we come back, let's talk about politics versus legal facts of the case, and which is guiding what you think the justices will do. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth, joined by John Malcolm from the Heritage Foundation. We'll be right back. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. And I'm joined by John Malcolm, the director of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies and a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. John, thanks for joining us and helping us weed our way through what is a major case in the Supreme Court today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
So last we left off, we were talking about, do you think, as you heard the arguments today and trying to sort of read the tea leaves of the insinuations of what's sort of the comments that were made. And I was sort of hearing you say that it does seem that they were looking at circumstances and looking at what may happen as a result. And, as a physician, I always think, the legal profession is similar to ours, and that we don't, we do what's right. We don't look at what may happen afterwards and predict things. We do things what's right with our patients. So are these judges looking at the tea leaves and trying to make, adjust their decisions based on what they think the political or economic ramifications will be, as there's all this gloom and doom all over the media right now?
Well, I think that the consequences of a ruling in favor of the plaintiffs was clearly on the mind of some of the justices. Mike Carbon tried to address that by saying the states can take action to try to ameliorate the situation. Justice Scalia said, look, Congress, if faced with all of this gloom and doom, surely Congress would act, which led General Verrilli to make a quip, you mean this Congress? And that caused a laugh in the courtroom. And, of course, Justice Alito even sat there and said, look, in extraordinary circumstances, our court, when it has made a ruling, has stayed its mandate. It has basically said, this is our ruling, but it will not go into effect until, say, after the tax year, to leave the states and Congress an opportunity to ameliorate the situation. But clearly that was in the back of the mind of some justices. I mean, the argument ought to be, look, just engage in statutory construction, which is what this court does day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out, and leave the consequences of all of this to the political branches of government, Congress and the president. But clearly there were other justices that had something else in mind.
And do you think a lot of that's overblown? I mean, Senator Hatch and a number of other conservatives have written pieces out just in the past couple of days basically saying, well, here's some options that could happen in order to solve this problem, and sort of an off-ramp it's been called, and other things as far as the disastrous scenario that they're saying for these millions that won't be covered, and premiums are going to go up 30 to 40%, that can be averted with certain strategic possibilities.
Sure. Well, as a doctor, you would know this better than I, but there's a very strong argument to be made that it is all of these mandates that are helping to drive up the cost of health care. People were promised to be able to keep their insurance plan if they liked it, and keep their doctor if they liked their doctor, and that turned out not to be so. But yes, there is a lot that states can do if you eliminate these mandates. If you start having portability, things like that, states can and Congress can get creative about all of this and come up with more free market, patient-centered solutions, and can take some stopgap measures to ameliorate any kind of hardships that might ensue from a ruling against the administration. None of this is intractable. That doesn't mean that it's easy.
And the amazing thing is, I read so many of the stories today talking about what could happen to premiums. Nobody's talking about the fact that every one of my patients almost is telling me how absurdly high their premiums have gone in the past year already.
Oh,
so,
yeah. No,
so to say
there's
there's
no
been
question.
exactly to say there's been no change and now it could get worse, sort of as the contexts have been odd. So we talked about what will happen if if the conservatives win this case. What happens if we lose? My fear is that we sort of took a narrow window on this case. And maybe you can talk about, are there other cases out there? Would we have emptied our quiver? Are we sort of done and we're sort of like Medicare and my father's generation of physicians who bought into, I think, was the first nail in the coffin of private practice was Medicare. But anyway, that was 40,
right.
50 years ago. So now is Obamacare a done deal if we lose this case?
Well, the only challenge that's made it to the court so far that was actually an existential threat to Obamacare was the first case, NFIB versus Sebelius. I would say that if the plaintiffs win this case, Obamacare doesn't cease to exist. It will not have been declared unconstitutional, but clearly it will have been a potentially mortal blow, and the president would have to go back to Congress and renegotiate. There are other challenges that will be out there. There was the Hobby Lobby case on the HHS mandate. There's still the Little Sisters of the Poor case that's out there. There's one other case lurking in the background that could pose an existential threat to Obamacare. It involves an origination clause argument. Essentially, when a bill passes that has tax ramifications, the Constitution provides that such bill shall originate in the House of Representatives. It's the body that is closest to the people. Having now, in the first case, Obamacare been declared a tax, essentially, then the question becomes, did this bill originate in the House as the Constitution provides, or in fact, did it originate in the Senate? What happened was the House sent up a version of Obamacare. The Senate literally kept the title, stripped out the entire text, and substituted its own text. That case has been sort of bumping around in the lower courts. I don't know whether the Supreme Court will take up that case, or whether they would sit there and say, "Look, you had 2 shots at Obamacare. We're done dealing with this." But those cases are still kicking around. But this is a very serious challenge to Obamacare, and if the plaintiffs lose and the conservative position loses, it's going to make that law a little bit more entrenched and harder to undo, at least from a judicial standpoint. Obviously, if there's a Republican president and the act is repealed, that's a political solution.
And I do think that ultimately part of, whoever those entities may be politically that tried to sort of dismiss the entire thing, I've always treated disease that you do one symptom at a time, and you try to treat the course problem also. But, I think you can still continue to take a bite out of this problem month after month, year after year, to try to get, as you said, different elements of choice, free markets, preserve private practice and other elements. And, I know Heritage has a lot of things you're doing to try to cover this beast on a number of fronts. So thank you for all you do, John, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you, Zudi. Pleasure
Appreciate
to be with
it. Thanks for being with us. And this is Zudi Jasser on the Seth Leibsohn Show. We will be right back to get back to the Keystone Pipeline and other issues as we get ready to welcome Bill Montgomery to the show. Thank you.
In my mind, it shines so bright. She's waiting there. I've been away too long.
This is Zudi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Principles, not politics. A lot going on to talk about today, and a great discussion on Obamacare, and we can only hope that the arguments are strong enough for the beginning of the unraveling of what has been one of the strongest restrictions upon the private practice of medicine, and I think also the abilities of patients to choose, which is the most important thing, is do patients have freedom to pick their provider, pick the benefits and what they want to pay for, choose what they want, and I think without question, since Obamacare has been in place, choices for patients have gone down, and the ability of us to practice medicine unimpeded by third parties has worsened. Now, have more people been covered? Yes, there seems to be more people covered, but I can tell you that more and more of my patients seem to complain every day about restrictions to their formulary that are much worse, copays that have gone up, formularies that don't allow the medicines that their physicians need them to write, procedures that they need done that take much longer to get authorized, on and on. So And we thought it was worse before Obamacare. We thought it was bad before Obamacare. Now it seems to only get worse. But at least they have that insurance card. So, this is one of the problems that we seem to be reinventing the wheel that Canada, the NHS in Britain, and other countries have already determined, is that the slide toward socialized medicine always ends up in bringing you back to some type of free market choice alternative, because that's just how people operate. We were talking about Keystone, and I can't emphasize this enough. This is Zuhdi Jasser, and I'm president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and it's amazing that the national security element of this debate never came up. The fact that we are talking about the ability to increase the resources of oil production, the ability for us to not be dependent on foreign oil, and as Jim Woolsey, former head of the CIA, has spoken around the country and around the world and says that we need to stop paying for our own demise. And that is what happens when we fuel the petrodollars of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We spoke earlier this week. I constantly try to teach America about why that is the new evil empire. Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about how evil Iran is, that the enemy of our enemy is our enemy, that they are simply playing a game of thrones. Well, our oil purchases from the Arab petrocracies, oligarchies, autocracies, thugocracies, which is what our families call them, is fueling the radicalization of their populations. You wonder where ISIS came from. Remember this. Saudi Arabia is the boot camp for future ISISes. Their ideology that they sprout will naturally end up in creating Al-Qaeda's. 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The monies that went to Syria initially to help the revolution was what radicalized the Syrian population. The revolution of our families in Aleppo and Damascus started by moderates, by diverse communities that were Christian, Druze, Alawite, Sunni, were very diverse. There was no Al-Qaeda in Syria at the beginning of the revolution in 2011. Then the Saudis started funding it. The Qataris, who are one of the international home bases for the Muslim Brotherhood, then ended up causing the radicalization of that revolution. And not to mention a Assad regime that conveniently let ISIS operate unscathed in the northeast part of Syria while they demolished neighborhoods in a genocidal pattern that killed almost 300,000 people now and displaced 5 million with barrel bombs and chemical weapons that they did not target to militant Islamist groups, but rather to the moderates. So when you think about Keystone Pipeline, think about this. If you want a reformed, more modern Islamic world, if they have natural resources that they can sell on the global market, they'll have no need to be creative and have free markets. As I mentioned before, Japan became the capitalistic success story after World War II because it had very little, if any, natural resources in its earth. So ultimately, it had to use the resources between its ears, and I think this is what is limiting and preventing. I mean, why have there not been a single product that has come out of the 300 plus million Arab population across the Middle East other than oil? Very few. I don't know of any cars produced, industrial, IT technology, other than desalination and oil. There's very few products that they sell on the global market that they produce. Why? They have no need to be creative. Their tribes pay. The Saudis. How Saudi Arabia avoided the Arab awakening? You had an Arab awakening that started in Tunisia, went to Egypt, and then bled over into Syria with the revolutions against their horrific dictatorships that were strangling their societies for over 40 years. That started with social media spread, and the Saudis were getting concerned because they started to see rumblings in their Twitter communications and social media that they were going to have a problem. Well, the way they stopped that was by writing a check of over equivalent to $40,000 to every one of their citizens. And that check it bought silence. And again, it perpetuated the petro-corruption of the Saudi regime and ultimately silence their citizenry, over 90% of whom, by the way, are on the government dole. So this is, I think, the problem with us depending on their oil. It makes us genuflect to their kings. It makes us take money from them for foundations like the Clinton Foundation and others that are worried about foreign flux. Our presidential libraries, universities like the Georgetown Center on Muslim-Christian Understanding that become basically laundromats for laundering what is actually happening within these countries to those who believe in freedom and are people of conscience. And today, Raif Badawi, one of the other stories that you'll see in major media, 67 congressmen and women signed a letter that was sent to the King of Saudi Arabia today saying, stop the nonsense with Raif Badawi, release him. His organization, Free Saudi Liberals, should be allowed to operate. He should be released from the flogging that he is set to be getting on a weekly basis. And now they've upped his charges, we believe, to one in which he's being on now put apostasy charges back, and the penalty for apostasy under Saudi Wahhabi Islamic law is death. So now back on the table is a death sentence beyond the whippings and floggings that he's been getting. Now the hats off to the 67 members of Congress that sent that letter. 7 of us had signed a letter to the Saudi ambassador in Washington 6 weeks ago saying that we would take the floggings for him, and Seth and I talked about that. We never got a response. Where's President Obama? Too worried about his legacy and coming to some deal with the Iranians that he doesn't want to upset the Saudis right now and get into this sectarian battle? You know, be strong on this. Raif Badawi, say his name, President Obama. Raif Badawi. Natan Sharansky knew that he'd be free when President Reagan mentioned his name and called the Soviets the evil empire. The Saudis are the head of the spear of the evil empire of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It is time for us to name Raif Badawi from the White House every day, not just once, but every day. Thank you to the members of Congress that sent that letter today. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. When we come back, we're going to be joined soon after the next segment with Bill Montgomery, Maricopa County Attorney, so stay with us. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show, and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And actually, I'm going to bring Bill on a little early, right before the beginning of the next hour. I am just honored to be joined by our Maricopa County attorney, Bill Montgomery. He's a West Point graduate, so we won't let the Army-Navy rivalry get between us. He's a Gulf War veteran and ASU Law School grad. Bill has been serving Maricopa County attorney since first being elected in the special election in 2010. He was reelected overwhelmingly in 2012, and the county attorney's office under his leadership has been recognized last year as one of only 8 high-performing prosecution agencies in the country. Bill, welcome to the Seth Leibsohn Show.
Thank you very much, Zuhdi. And me being on with a Navy veteran is evidence of my ability to work across the aisle.
Exactly. Thank you very much. You know, now Bethesda Naval, where I did my training, has become they have purple uniforms, which I guess means all branches are welcome. So this is now a purple show. I have so much to talk to you about, so I'm glad that we started a little earlier before the hour. But in this brief segment, what I want to do is talk first about the trial that started in Boston. You know, it's sort of a no-brainer that the Tsarnaev brother is going to be convicted. His defense basically said he did it, so that's not even an issue. But sort of in the trial, what they're talking about is whether he did it, and you can fill in the blank for me. The question is that they want to prove, the defense wants to prove that his brother made him do it. And I guess the prosecution very appropriately has said he was a part of a holy war. And by holy war, they mean there was a motive to kill as many people as possible because of a greater issue. And it's amazing that this is happening today, right after the administration had this conference on fighting violent extremism. Nobody wanted to say what it is, and yet when it comes to the courtroom, they say it's a holy war, and the defense wants to say, well, his brother made him do it. Can you tell us why that's important?
Well, I think when you get down to the local level and you're looking at the actions of individuals where it's impacted a specific community, and the evidence is there for everyone to see, and in this case the evidence will be presented to a jury for them to see, you can't call it anything but what it actually is. And yet, once we get to the national level and we start having the mix of both domestic and international politics, we find an administration that has handcuffed itself in being able to deal with the threat and name it in a way where we can adequately defend ourselves domestically and deal with threats internationally.
Amen. And I think that's so important. And when we come back, we're going to have a much better, longer time to talk. I want to first talk about, why does it matter that his brother made him do it? I mean, why is that such a big part of the defense? And then we'll talk about sort of the, lawfare that happens, that these Islamist groups are suing what seem to be open and shut cases and putting us on our heels, if you will. So this is Zuhdi Jasser, joined by Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery. I'm filling in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. We'll be right back on the other side of the hour.
The Seth Leibsohn Show, where it's principles, not politics. Now, guest hosting for Seth, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Welcome back. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Principles, not politics. And one of the most rational, smart, intellectual, and people that I've gotten to know that has not been afraid and has been courageous in identifying the threat of radical Islam is Bill Montgomery. He is our Maricopa County attorney, a West Point grad and Gulf War veteran. His office has been recognized last year as one of only 8 high-performing prosecution agencies in the country. And I thought, who better than to walk us through what's happening not only in Boston with the case against the Sarnea brother, who is undergoing trial right now, but also to look at sort of the bigger battle granularly in every city. As we hear now, the heads of Homeland Security are saying ISIS is in every one of the 50 states. But what we can do to stop this whack-a-mole program and move forward in strategy. So welcome back, Bill. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Zuhdi.
So let's continue on this issue about why does it matter in this trial that his brother made him do it versus a bigger issue of holy war and the Islamist movement? Why is the defense trying to make that distinction?
Well, when you're looking at a criminal trial such as what they have going on, there's basically 2 different phases. There is what you could call the guilt phase, and then there's the punishment aspect of the trial. And in the guilt phase, when the evidence is very clear that someone engaged in the conduct in question that has been criminalized, murder is a very easy one to point to say, you either killed someone or you didn't, and there's plenty of evidence here in order to assign responsibility to this brother. But the defense wants to then take their energy and their efforts to try to minimize culpability or responsibility for what happened in an effort to get a lesser punishment. They don't want to have to argue whether their client is guilty in the first place, and then after a jury says, no, he did do it, then stand up in front of the jury with their credibility already impugned, and then try to argue, well, okay, maybe you're right, maybe he did do it, but let me tell you why he really isn't as responsible as the prosecution wants you to think that he is. And by trying to argue that his brother made him do it, it's an effort to swing the jury's attention to the other brother who's not on trial as being the more culpable of the two and the one more deserving of the degree of punishment that the jury is being asked to find. So it's an effort to minimize culpability, limit responsibility, and thereby try to get a lesser punishment.
I mean, what's absurd about that, Bill, is that you could apply that to any case. Nidal Hassan, who declared Allahu Akbar before he killed 13 of his fellow soldiers and maimed 31 of them, was trained and followed the instructions of Imam Awlaki, a imam who was born in the U.S., himself radicalized here and went on to declare war against the U.S., and so he could say that, they could say in his defense that Imam made him do it and he was just following orders. It doesn't make any sense to me. It can always be used as a defense.
Well, it can be, but then it's up to a jury to determine what weight, if any, to give to it. And, of course, it will be the job of the prosecutor to be able to illustrate for a jury that that kind of a defense really shouldn't be given any weight and has no merit under those circumstances. It's one of the important aspects of our criminal justice system that you don't charge someone, you don't seek to have them convicted of offense and then be punished if they aren't, in fact, responsible for their conduct. Diminished capacity defenses, all the way up to and including guilty except insane, or all aspects of our criminal justice system will be recognized that if someone truly can't be held responsible individually for what they did, usually because they, in general terms, can't appreciate what it was that they did or how wrong it was, usually somebody with a mental illness, then we don't do it. So in every other instance, though, and based upon our own military experiences, you're responsible for yourself and for others, and you're responsible for the decisions you make.
And so let's talk about, there was an accomplice that was very quickly connected to these brothers. His name was Ibrahim Todashev, and the FBI raided his house and questioned him, and then somehow one thing led to the other. One of the agents was attacked, as he had reported, and then it ended up in what appeared to be a legitimate shooting. And the reason I say legitimate is then it was investigated by the Florida Bureau office there, and that investigation showed that there was nothing inappropriate about the shooting. Now you see that this group that calls itself the Council on American Islamic Relations, and many of us in the Muslim community that are reformists put them sort of in the category of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, these groups that are offshoot of various forms of the ideological movement of political Islam in America. And they call themselves a rights group, but yet they seem to have a certain questionable agenda at times. And I want to talk about this suit. What they're doing now is they filed a $30 million lawsuit against the Bureau. And they actually, at the time of the shooting, rather than declare their outrage at the radicalization of those brothers and the radicalization of their accomplices and others, they quickly wanted to put somehow the legal system on question. And they now have put their money where their mouth is, and they're asking for $30 million because, and by the way, they're doing this bill on the behalf of the family of the Chechen man who was killed. And they, in their statement yesterday, they said the family in Chechnya spoke to CARE. So here you have them speaking to families outside our country, suing our FBI. Can you tell me a little bit about that, if you know any of the details or what you know, and how you sort of look at what CARE is doing here? Is this a legitimate sort of ACLU-type tactic, or is there more involved here in what you see?
Well, I'd have to take issue with the general use of the term legitimate ACLU tactic.
Exactly.
I'm usually
No
on the
kidding.
opposite side of those lawsuits.
Sort of the Al Sharptonization of Islam, I call it.
Yeah, well, and I think that is an important point to raise, that where we see CARE get involved in what you could also characterize it as strategic litigation in an effort to marginalize the FBI's ability to investigate cases involving radical Islamists and an extremist Muslim ideology, and try to keep them from being able to be utilized in any particular type of investigation. They've also complained, CARE and some of the other Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups that you mentioned, to the White House and to federal law enforcement agencies about the type of training that had been given to FBI agents or that they had participated in the past. And the straight-faced argument that CARE would make is that they're trying to protect fellow Muslims and to maintain the integrity of Islam in the United States from unfair prejudice and unfair attacks. But the problem is that when you do that every single time without any apparent rational assessment of whether that's a legitimate point to make, it starts to ring rather hollow. And the organization itself then, I think, fairly falls under question of, well, what is your real motive here? When the knee-jerk reaction each and every time is that, as in this instance, what the FBI did here may have been simply a racist or prejudiced handling of a particular Muslim youth, and that the use of force was extreme, and this is what the FBI does in these types of situations.
Yeah, and
sort of. Go ahead.
And exactly. I mean, the reason I mentioned ACLU is the ACLU makes no bones that they sort of pride themselves on defending the most sometimes unsavory characters in society because they feel that's sort of what keeps our constitutional system at check. But the problem is CARE presents itself as representing mainstream Muslims in America, and yet in the name of mainstream Muslims defends individuals that are major cogs in a terrorist operation that killed and maims many that this individual was clearly involved in. So they'll say that they're trying to maintain the integrity of the American system, not only Islam, but the American system. And I think it seems to me to be exploitative. And as a Muslim, I feel that it represents sort of the periphery and margins of where our community should be leading. Not, there was another case of a imam by the name of Luqman Abdullah who was shot also when the FBI raided his home because he had arms and explosive devices. And as they approached his home, he had shot. Now, CARE, and especially the CARE director in Detroit where this happened, Daoud Walid, who feels that this was a conspiracy, that they went to kill him. The evidence, again, showed nothing of the such. They demanded an autopsy, which CARE got, and there was no evidence shown that there was anything inappropriate about that shooting. And, oh, by the way, never mind that he ran an organization called Ummah, which was a separatist organization. So, I mean, I couldn't tell you, Bill, how enraged I was as an American to see this group, CARE in Michigan, get the attention of defending this separatist who was a militant Islamist in Detroit and say that it was an inappropriate thing when he walked in and when the FBI walked in and was shot as they were. Do you want to comment on sort of the link and the pattern that this defense in Florida is sort of a pattern beyond simply one case?
And when you compare and contrast those two cases, what's most curious is that in the Detroit case, CARE argued vociferously that the imam's religion should not be part of that trial at all. And yet here in the Florida case, it appears that religion is the only basis for their involvement. So, I think it allows you to draw the fair conclusion that CARE only wants you to discuss Muslims and Islam when they want you to, and then only using approved text with approved speakers.
Exactly. And in the next segment, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about sort of this attempt for them to enforce blasphemy laws on law enforcement leaders like yourself who have the courage to train their officers and attorneys and others about sort of the issue. I spoke today at the Arizona Senate chaired committee by Steve Smith to the Committee on Public Safety and military and technology, and I talked to them about sort of the pool that these radicals swim in and how important it is for America to know what we're fighting globally and locally, and ultimately what happens to those of us who try to speak out. So when we come back, Bill and I are going to get into sort of the bigger picture, the 70,000-foot view of fighting radical Islam in America and what we can do on a granular level and on a national level with Homeland Security and combating organizations and their lobby like the Council on American Islamic Relations. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn. We'll be right back. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn, and it's a privilege to be sitting in his chair. And I wish I could be with you all night long, but this is our last hour this evening. I'm filling in for Seth this week as he's away, and it is just a privilege to be joined by my Army colleague as a Navy officer, my Army colleague Bill Montgomery, a West Point grad, Gulf War veteran, proud to say that he is our Maricopa County attorney. And under his leadership, his office has been recognized as one of 8 high-performing prosecution agencies in the country. Welcome, Bill. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Zuhdi.
So let's talk big picture. You know, you and I got to know each other much better last year when you had a lot of pushback because, oh, my gosh, you had the gall to teach your office about Islamic law, about the ideology that threatens us. And I, as a Muslim, am trying to teach America about these issues all the time. They try to call me anti-Muslim, but it doesn't stick because any Arizonans, especially that know me, know how much I love my faith and have helped not only mosques, but how much a intense relationship with God is part of my life. But yet, They will do anything to demonize people that try to peel the onion of radical Islam and what comes from within it, and are part of sort of what I call the bigger machinery of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, this global movement that tries to enact blasphemy laws in their countries that are theocracies. And here in America, they do it by proxy, by putting the fear, like you mentioned with the FBI cases. They put fear into people so that they don't act the way they should in a free country. So if you want to remind our audience what happened a few months ago with what you tried to do and why you did it, and how that's a pattern of what should happen nationally in every county attorney's office.
Sure. Well, last year, after a very thorough vetting of the training that was being offered, we brought a group into town that put on a one-day training called Understanding the Threat. And in the run-up to that, there was great resistance and accusations from folks in the local Muslim community who even got other religious colleagues from other faiths to sign a letter claiming that this was all prejudice towards Muslims and that it amounted to hate speech and that I shouldn't be sponsoring it. And my response to it was to continue to engage the local Muslim community. Gave me the opportunity to reach out and to connect with you and develop a friendship and share time trying to understand issues better. Gave me the excuse to read your book, Battle for the Soul of Islam, which was incredibly helpful in helping to define the issue, too, and appropriate responses to it. But, I also tried to get folks to understand that by reacting the way that they did, it almost underscored and justified some of the prejudices that we sometimes hear about, that the Muslim community was monolithic, that they would react very negatively to any kind of discussion that might appear to be negative towards the Prophet Muhammad or Islam in general, and that we were going to be able to have this discussion to be able to distinguish the use of sacred texts as a basis for racist or extremist ideologies from the otherwise unremarkable reliance by sincere practitioners of any given faith, and underscore the importance of that as a critical task for local law enforcement to be able to make those distinctions.
And the bizarre thing, Bill, is that since that time you have the president of Egypt, you have Turkish leaders and others that have said, we need to reform these documents, we need to reform our interpretation of Islam that's creating these monsters. And by the way, these are not Democrats saying these are dictators who have various, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday, sort of a Game of Thrones, and they're just upset that the radicals are creating chaos in their countries and aren't doing the beheadings neatly like the King of Saudi Arabia likes to do them. But bottom line is they're saying what our reformers are saying, but unfortunately reformers in their countries get put in jail. In America, reformers are marginalized, and leaders like yourself who try to give us a voice to say that Muslims aren't monolithic and that the counterterrorism is countering a tactic, that there's an ideology that fuels that if we're going to be doing that, then ultimately we need to engage in this issue. And I don't want to relitigate sort of what happened last year. I wanted you to set the stage, and thank you for doing that. Let's look forward, because what happened to you, it happened, I can tell you now, I've been doing this since 9/11. Every American that loves this country, that tries to stick their neck out, gets hit on the head by the gotcha thing where somebody, like you brought in a group that tried to teach this. Some of them had said a few things that I had problems with, but yet it doesn't make their entire course bad. And yet we try to have an education about this. The Prime Minister yesterday educated America about the Iranian threat, and yet there's here or there gotchas that people try to have. So how do we move forward? What would be your advice to other county attorneys, to attorneys generals around the country, heads of Homeland Security? Today, as I testified to the Arizona Senate, I saw our new DPS chief be unanimously endorsed. So what would be your advice to them as we move forward?
Well, I think first and foremost is to honor our respective oaths of office, which call upon us to protect and defend our country against foreign and domestic threats. It also requires us to uphold our federal Constitution which includes those First Amendment protections of the right of free speech, the right of free association, free exercise of religion, and the prevention of Congress from passing any law respecting an establishment of religion. And that if we honor those oaths and if we protect those rights, then we should be able to, in a very fair and objective way, identify ideological sources of extremism and be able to distinguish that from perfectly loyal, faithful Americans who may also be faithful practitioners of Islam. But you know what, Judy? I see the same thing in radical white supremacist groups who want to use Christian texts to justify their racist ideology, and that has been used as a justification for violence. So it's not exclusive to Islam or the Muslim community either, and we should be able to have that discussion within that broader context.
And there may exactly, and there may be things sometimes that non-Muslims may say that might be sort of, as we educate about our faith, realize that it was sort of off base, but that shouldn't make that person a bigot. It just sort of makes it clear that they need a little education. So I hope you can empower others to not look at what happened to you as a result of partisan wrangling from media and others to say that that's a reason not to do it, but rather a reason to do it because there's so much education that has to happen.
Yeah, and I actually took advantage of what happened to point out the need for this kind of a dialogue. That's where we've got to make sure that we're having these conversations to encourage dialogue and cooperation and not allow misunderstanding or any segmenting of our community into us and them when we are all the ones who will wind up suffering from wanton acts of violence and extremist terrorists.
Amen. Amen. Bill, you're a patriot. God bless you for all you do. We're at your side. We have a Muslim Liberty Project. We have so many opportunities, Muslims that are reformists ready to work with you. Stay with us. Thank you for being with us, Bill. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Thank you for joining me. It is just a privilege and a humbling honor to be in Seth's chair. I am Zuhdi Jasser, the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And Bill, last segment, Bill Montgomery mentioned a book, my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is my story. And it talks about why my family came to America and how much they love America, why I joined the Navy, why I took on this battle on top of my private practice in medicine and everything we do, why I felt that this was something that an American Muslim, and now many of us, thousands of us across the country that are part of not only our organization but a coalition of organizations that are Muslim, American, some Canadian, some European, that believe that this is a battle against theocracy, against political Islam, that the violent component is but the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper ideology that believes in the supremacism of the Islamic State. Now, they could believe sometimes it's democratic. They could come to power through elections. Remember, the Khomeinists of Iran came to power through elections, and that democracy was a one-way ticket. And ultimately, they now are the biggest threat to mankind globally. It was great to talk to Bill Montgomery last segment. He is such a great patriot and calls him as he sees him. And we've been missing that sometimes, I think, not only locally but nationally, in people that aren't afraid to say what they feel and believe in endorsing publicly the fact that we protect our country from enemies, foreign and domestic. And, the agents of foreign governments. I started the program earlier by talking about how Nancy Pelosi's picture was on Iranian media. And, sometimes the endorsement, the things we say and do should be exposed when it actually compromises our national security. And ultimately, I think as we look at whether it be the national security compromised by dependency on foreign oil, we talked about that with Keystone, and the unfortunate inability to reverse that veto from President Obama, and I think the national security implications of that, and also what's happening in trials. We saw with the trial of Nidal Hassan. We see now with the Boston bombers trial where the Tsarnaev brother, the details of what happened on that fateful day, April 15th, 2013, is now going to be relived by all of us. Why? Because we live in a country of the rule of law, not a country like Saudi Arabia where innocents like Raif Badawi are whipped and convicted within a few days and sentenced to inhuman punishments, not because they committed acts of terror, but because in the name of Islam, they are convicted of insulting Islam simply because they wanted to be free and criticize their leaders and criticize clerics and try to modernize a faith that they love. And unfortunately, they are marginalized, and these draconian regimes fuel the radicalization of millions of Muslims across the planet with their petrodollars that spread throughout the world. And yet, when our White House has a conference in which it brought in all the so-called experts on what they call violent extremism, they invited who? No, not the reformers, not the people Bill Montgomery and I were just talking about, but they invited Islamist apologists. They invited 60 countries, most of whom were the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And these countries, many of whom obviously are allies against radical Islam and the militant component, but they are participants in the Game of Thrones where they just don't want these militant groups taking over their countries. Now, the ideas that they permeate throughout their societies in the name of Islam creates these monsters. And I compared it in a release that we had. I said, it's like inviting the meth distributors to a conference on how to counter drug violence. And sure, the white-collar distributors that are making millions off of the sale of illegal drugs globally don't want to participate in the violence, and they condemn violence done in the name of selling drugs, but they certainly would not be the ones to help us have a drug interdiction program. And I think similarly, if you're fighting radical Islam, you don't invite the Islamist ideologues who believe in the supremacy of the Islamic State to your shindig that you're trying to counter the ideas and create movements that counter that, where they brought in Google, they brought in IT, and here I'm waiting for that discussion about radio-free Arabia, radio-free Islam, in which we begin to spread the ideas of liberty so that they can create movements that separate mosque and state. And they're doing it already without our help. Even in this post-American presidency that we have, we see in Tunisia, the Ennahda party was ousted by a secular party, then lost an election, even though the Islamists won initially after the king of Tunisia was ousted in a revolution that started the Arab awakening in January 2011. And now, 4 years later, there was an election in January that so few people heard about that ultimately had the secularists win. There is no stronger counterterrorism than having the secular state win out over the Islamic State. 1 year of the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt did more to modernize Islam than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, or Mubarak. Now think about, does that make any sense? Some of you are like going, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Well, when the Brotherhood ran Egypt, the Egyptians woke up and said, oh my gosh, these Islamists are running government. They're running their judiciaries. They're running our schools. And they're teaching our kids to be supremacist theocrats. They're teaching us that we can't criticize the president because it's like criticizing Islam. So all of a sudden, Mohammed Morsi and his Islamic Muslim Brotherhood party became the icons of what the Islamist movement would do to Egypt. And all of a sudden, you had, in June 2013, 10 times the number of people in the streets of Cairo than you did in the streets of Cairo to oust President Mubarak, who was a military dictator. So 1 year of the Brotherhood running Egypt did more to defeat those ideas. So ultimately, we need to increase what's at stake. Muslims felt there was a lot at stake in Egypt, so they went to the streets to defeat the Brotherhood. American Muslims, I think, are getting a pass because we don't call a spade a spade. It's Islamist terrorism. It is militant Islamism that is driving them. That's like the Brotherhood It's like the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. These creations of ISIS and radical groups are not coming out of thin air. And in our last segment, in our next segment, we are going to continue and talk about what should be our strategy domestically. How do we develop a plan to fight the radicals and empower free-minded Muslims? This is Zuhdi Jasser in for Seth Leibsohn. Thanks for being with us. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. And, in today's world, it is often important not only what we're scared of, what we're trying to protect, but who we love. And I am proud to be sitting in Seth's chair. And, I do this work because I love this country. I want this country to be safe for next generations. Yesterday we talked about legacy. And, I think it's important to always contextualize the stories of the day and not just sort of dismiss them as simply isolated stories. Things are connected. Organizations, individuals usually have agendas. We all have an agenda of what we're trying to do. Hopefully we can build friendships and alliances with people that have agendas that are moral, that are shaped by making us stronger, freer, and more successful in allowing us each to be ourselves. And that was sort of the American dream. In my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, my parents felt American the moment they came here and felt that they understood what America was, and they wanted to be part of the American experiment. And I was blessed to have been born here. And they taught me that I was saved from having to live in the savagery that was the Assad or the Ba'athist regime at the time, and then Hafiz Assad took over in 1970, and we know what his son now is doing. He learned well from his father. And ultimately, America was truly that city on the hill for my family. And I also learned that freedom doesn't come easy. You have to give back to society. Just like you give back to God through worship, you give back to your community, you give back to your family. And ultimately, I think now in this challenge that we have, the cancer of political Islam is spreading and filling in vacuums. I think it's important for us to engage, most importantly, Muslims in helping to defeat this. It is not going to be defeated if we think all of Islam is the problem. That will actually radicalize Muslims more. We have to engage our allies within the House of Islam and look back. How much of this recurrent... I was struck by, you remember the movie Groundhog Day, right? He kept waking up. It was the same time, same day, every day, repeatedly, and it got quite tiring. And it seems bizarre that we've been, since 9/11, this battle, by the way, didn't start in 9/11. It started back in 79 with the Islamist revolution of the Khomeinists that then took our hostages. That was probably the first salvo in this war. But ultimately, political Islam did not start then. That's when the salvo started, and they began calling us openly the Great Satan, which is the biggest threat to them. They don't see the biggest threat to them as their dictators of the Middle East that they form their OIC with. The biggest threat to political Islam is liberty and freedom. So that's why they demonize America. That's why they demonize Israel and European countries, because these are places in which democracy thrives. And it's important that we begin to articulate that this is what's at stake. We did not see the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union until we articulated that what was at stake was freedom against communism, Soviet imperialism, and socialism. That's when we when we had Reagan, who began to talk about peace through strength. It broke the back of their economy, broke the back of their ideology, and the Soviet Union fell apart without the need for military conflict at that time. And I think similarly now, we're in a generation in which we're probably in the same place we were in the early 50s against the Soviet threat. We still haven't been able to get our head around what is political Islam. This is a much more complicated threat because it has various ethnicities, various national permutations across the Middle East, but yet the common thread is political Islam and the Islamic State, and the fact that the radicals, the militants, would die for the Islamic State, and our allies are those who would die for freedom. and liberty. It's that simple. We're fighting Islamo-patriotism and the concept of the Islamic State. So we see the Boston bombers today. Now the bomber who's blaming his brother, not his ideology. And the prosecution, actually, if you want a clinic in what radical Islam is fueled by, read the transcript of the prosecution. They're talking about this being a holy war of militants against these radicals, militants who fuel and create these radicals against us. And I think ultimately this is what we seem to think it's appropriate in the courtroom, but yet when we're countering violent extremism in the White House, we don't engage the real issue, and it's sad. I was pleased and thankful to Senator Steve Smith for inviting me to testify today and provide a briefing to his committee on public safety and technology and border safety on the threat of radical Islam and political Islam. There's ISIS in 50 states. Every state right now has a threat of individuals that Homeland Security says they're following with connections abroad. And this is our whack-a-mole program is only going to need to increase further and further. We need to engage moderates. We need to engage reformists against political Islam. And unfortunately, a lot of what's happening, we need to contextualize better. Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech wasn't Israel against Islam. It was the free world against Islamist supremacism. And as he said, the enemy of our enemy is our enemy. And we seem to forget that. Please take a look at Press TV, Iranian media. Take a look at Syrian National News Agency and see what they say about America before we start saying, well, the administration seems to now have changed its mind that, well, maybe Assad shouldn't go because he's working in the same direction against ISIS. Wrong. That is absurd. He is allowing ISIS to thrive, and it is a tool in the arsenal of a tyrannical killing machine known as the Assad regime that will kill anything in its way and allow anything to grow that legitimizes its military dictatorship. So the only way we will defeat and decimate ISIS is for us to do it. And as Senator McCain and so many others who understand the influence of America abroad understands, we need to defeat and decimate ISIS, whether it be in Syria, Iraq, or in Libya. And we also need to begin to have a strategy to empower both the anti-Islamists and the anti-dictatorship movements within Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. And we're seeing now, you go to Iranian media, they're proud of pushing back ISIS in Tikrit. You remember who was in Tikrit? We were there during the Bush administration, and now we've surrendered it to Islamist hegemony from the Shia Islamists of the Khomeinists. So, it saddens me that in a country as blessed as the United States of America that provides freedom to so many of our families that have escaped military regimes, that we cannot have this conversation, that there are few leaders like Bill Montgomery, like Seth Leibsohn, who understand the need to give the microphone just sometimes to us rebels, us Islamic reformers who are not unwilling to take on the challenge of political Islam from within the House of Islam. This is Zuhdi Jasser in the House, sitting for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show, Principles Not Politics. Follow me on Twitter, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DRZUHDI Jasser. Go to our website, aifdemocracy.org, and follow me on Facebook, MZ Jasser. We'll be right back for our last segment. This is Zuhdi Jasser, and, I want to end today by saying thank you. And as the song just said, thank you for finding me. And thank you, Seth, for finding me and giving me some time to let America know that there are some Muslims who want to be part of the solution, who want to be in the arena, as I talked about, that Teddy Roosevelt said we should do, and want to be part of the reform that ultimately will fix this problem globally that is plaguing not only our faith community, but the world. Collateral damage to the battle, the civil war within the House of Islam is likely going to be the free world. And if radical Islam gets a nuclear weapon, that's what will happen. If radical Islam gets a foothold in the West and puts us into a self-combustion mode, as they tried to do in 9/11 and on, we will not be able to survive the growing threat of this vacuum that's being filled by political and radical Islam. And again, the solution will come, I think, just like in the West. The solution to theocracy was Jefferson and Thomas Paine. You know, people say, where are the reformers? Where are the Martin Luthers? You know, let me reboot that for you, please. Don't ask about Martin Luther and Islam, okay? Ask about the Thomas Paines, the Thomas Jeffersons, who love their faith but want to push back and marginalize theocracy from government. There are plenty of those. They were filling the streets of Cairo, filling the streets of Tunisia. So thank you to all of you who empower Muslims to be the Thomas Paines of tomorrow, and giving us the opportunity to ask the tough questions. Today's news, we went from talking too much about foreign policy to looking domestically about what's happening with possibly in the Supreme Court. We'll wait and see what the closing arguments will be, and ultimately, as a private practice doc, I hope that those closing arguments are the beginning of choice for patients and the end of the suffocation from Obamacare. We talked about the Keystone Pipeline and the need to bring up national security. We were joined by Bill Montgomery, who gave us some insight into not only the Boston Bombers trial that started, but also these lawfare fronts that Islamist groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations bring up as tools to keep us on the defense. Well, it's time for us to be on the offense. And you know what? If I'm an American Muslim and there's a Muslim congressman like Andre Carson who sits on the Intel Committee, I think it's appropriate that I have the right to ask why he has a security clearance to get the country's most sensitive intelligence, and yet, as the Center for Security Policy report questions, yet he's raising money for groups that are part of the Muslim Brotherhood Legacy Group. Let me drop that little question, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow and other issues. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn as he takes a week off. I am the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. My book is A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It is a privilege to share the airwaves with you, and thank you for being with us on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Good night.